Welcome again to First Baptist Lancaster. We are so glad that you're taking time to share with us the stories of the Bible that will give you instruction for how to get help in living your life today. And we're working in the Old Testament, and a lot of people say, well, the Old Testament it doesn't mean anything today, but it does. It's so full of rich stories and good advice for us in how to live our Christian life today. Today's chapter continues to be, of course, from Chuck Swindoll's book. I don't want to ever forget to give him credit for this great book that I'm using. It's David, a Man of Passion and Destiny. Don't forget, you can probably find that at half price, or you might even still find it at a Christian bookstore that's selling current things. I'm not sure if it's being published at the present time, but if you can find it, it should become a permanent part of your Christian library. Now, we're in chapter 6 today, and it has a kind of a strange title, Every Crutch Removed. Every Crutch Removed. Now, we're talking about David, and we're talking about the champion of Israel, the future king of Israel, and we're talking about every crutch removed. So there are going to be some strange things that happen in this chapter. And it's even kind of strange to refer to them as crutches. Let's talk about crutches for just a minute before we go on. Now, you should have a mental picture probably of what a crutch looks like. If you've ever had a broken leg and you couldn't walk, you had to have some assistance. You had to lean on something, and that something was probably a wooden or a metal thing that you put underneath your arms, and you used it as a leg so that you didn't put weight on that injured leg. Well, we're talking about crutches today, in which we lean on in our life. And there's nothing wrong with crutches. So I don't want crutches to have a negative impact, because if you don't use a crutch when your leg is broken, you don't go anywhere, do you? Sometimes you have to have a crutch. You need a crutch. But we're seeing what happens when the crutches that we depend on in our life are removed. Well, let's think a minute about where we were when we ended last chapter. Remember that David had slain Goliath, and he was the hero of the whole nation. The whole nation just couldn't get enough of David. And the women, of course, had been celebrating when he came back to Jerusalem, and they sang, Saul has slain his thousands and David has slain his 10,000s. And what did that do to Saul? It just sent him straight into the depths of depression. Here's this hero that's more popular than me. How can I stand it? What can I do? He'd been using David already as his harp player to help him to soothe his troubled mind and troubled spirit when he was in depression. But now then, this young man is so successful that people recognize him above me. And he had that me attitude that, can anybody be stronger than me? If I'm the king, I mean, how can that work? So we see that he became jealous. We talked about how vicious jealousy can be last time. It caused him to be suspicious and to imagine things. Even when nothing was being done, anything that David did, he was suspicious that something was being done to harm him or to go against him. He no longer trusted David. Now, this is the guy that saved the nation by killing Goliath. All of this jealousy further deteriorated Saul's emotional and mental stability. Remember, he wasn't stable to start with, and this just put him on a slippery slope, and he slid even further down into depression. I'd like to read you just a little bit of what Chuck Swindoll wrote about this. After what we've talked about, it says that Saul could no longer contain himself. After he'd heard all this, he just couldn't contain himself. Chuck Swindoll says the writer H.G. Wells says of one of his strange characters, Mr. Polly, he was not so much a human being as a civil war. I think that is a perfect description of Saul. He became a living civil war, miserable, possessed of an evil spirit, mentally breaking, a suspicious, angry, jealous man. As a result, he struck out against his most trusted servant, David. Look at 1 Samuel 18, 10 through 11 with me. An evil spirit from God came mightily upon Saul, and he raved in the midst of the house while David was playing the harp with his hand, as usual. And a spear was in Saul's hand. And Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. Now here's the tragedy of all of Saul's thinking. He still needs David. He needs David to play that harp, to soothe his troubled mind and the misery that he's in. This is about the only break he gets in his suffering. And here he is trying to kill the one who's delivering him momentarily from his suffering. So, look at the change in Saul's attitude. He actually tried to kill David. Now, we don't know what happened to David at this point, if he left the court, went home. It doesn't say that he did, but a little later we're going to find out he was back playing the harp again. Now, a lot of people, if they'd had one experience with a javelin being thrust at them while they were playing the harp, they'd have said, goodbye, Saul, you're on your own. David was either super loyal or he was afraid not to come back. But in any event, we have Saul attempting murder at this point in our lesson. Has anyone ever threatened your life? Just think how you might feel if anyone attempted to do you in. So just imagine what was going through David's mind. There has to be this total confusion. Here I am serving the king in the best way I can. I'm loyal, I'm true, I do whatever he needs, and he tries to kill me. He probably just doesn't get it. Here's David doing what he can to lighten the king's dark spirits when all of a sudden, whoosh, a sharp-pointed spear flies right past his head. Suddenly reality strikes. Man, this guy is nuts. He's out of his head. Yet the next verse says that Saul was afraid of David. Now think about this. The person that Saul is trying to eliminate, he's actually afraid of. He's afraid because he sees, remember we saw that David was succeeding in everything that he did, and Saul was not succeeding in anything that he did. He can see the difference in his life and David's. He can see the difference in when God is working in you and is anointing you, and when he has left you. The Spirit of God had departed from Saul, remember, and Samuel had anointed David. The Spirit of God was now on David, and he could see the difference, and it scared him to death. He didn't know anything to do but try to get rid of David. Look at 1 Samuel 18, 14 through 15. And David was prospering in all his ways, for the Lord was with him. When Saul saw that he was prospering greatly, he dreaded him. We mentioned this scripture last time, but it bears repeating, that he just couldn't stand it because everything David did brought him glory, and nothing he did brought him any. He was so jealous, insanely jealous. Please remember that David had done nothing wrong. He'd been a model of humility, dependability, and integrity. He had done right, but everything was now backfiring. God begins to pull the crutches from beneath David one by one. So the things that David has depended on in an earthly sense are going to be eliminated in this chapter. Okay, let's look at the next scripture, 1 Samuel 19, 9 through 10. Now remember, Saul has already attempted murder once. Look what happens in this reading. Now there was an evil spirit from the Lord on Saul as he was sitting in his house with his spear in his hand, and David was playing the harp with his hand. We've been there before. We've seen this same scenario. We've seen what Saul did. I don't know how David had the courage to come in there. And there he is sitting with a spear again. It's not like he wasn't armed just the same way he was before. And Saul once again tried to pin David to the wall with his spear. But he slipped away out of Saul's presence so that he struck the spear into the wall. And David fled and escaped that night. So David had had enough. 2 times taught him that if he wanted to continue living, he'd better get out of Saul's presence. So now David is losing the crutch of his position. He's no longer the king's musician. He's no longer the king's captain in the army or whatever rank he held in the army, because he can't with Saul trying to kill him. Now let's talk about David's wife. Her name was Michal. And the strange part about it is she was Saul's daughter. You remember that one of the bribes, you might say, that Saul was using to try to get people to fight against Goliath was, I'll give you my daughter's hand in marriage if you'll just go out there and fight him. Well, David didn't go to get a wife, but he went because he saw God insulted, and he wanted to be sure that God's name was not being insulted. But as a result of Saul's promise, then Michal was to be David's wife. Now actually, look at 1 Samuel 18, 20 through 21. Now Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. When they told Saul the thing was agreeable to him, and Saul thought, I will give her to him, that she may become a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. So he said, yeah, I'll do this, but he thought he could use his daughter as a weapon against David. And so this is a mixed blessing for David. He has a wife, but before Saul will let him actually marry her, he says, okay, David. Now, you know, it was the custom in that day to give a dowry for a bride. And Saul asked for a strange dowry. You know, the Israelites, to symbolize the treaty or the covenant with God and Abraham, established the rites of circumcision. Well, no other nation in that area of the world then practiced that. But Saul says, what you have to give me for my daughter's hand in marriage is you have to circumcise 100 Philistine men. Well, guess what? There were no lines of men lined up to say, yes, I'll let you circumcise me. There were none. This would have been totally foreign to them. That was not their culture, to be circumcised. And so the only way David was going to be able to fulfill that was to what? Kill those men. And that's what he did. And he brought back the evidence to Saul, and Saul then gave Michal to be his wife. So Saul had all this figured out in his mind. What Saul really hoped would happen is that one of those Philistine men would say, hey, I'm not taking this, and would actually kill David. He hoped David would not survive these 100 men that he had to kill in order to circumcise them. But David was once again successful. Okay, so he has Michal as his wife now. In 1 Samuel 19, 11 through 12, then Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him in order to put him to death in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, if you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you will be put to death. So Michal let David down through a window, and he went out and fled and escaped. Now, he left his wife out of fear for his life. And he didn't have her there for his comfort and his companionship anymore, because he had to leave her to flee. So there is another crutch that God removed. We know, as those of us who have been married for many years, know that there's nothing quite like the companionship and the support of our spouse. David was going to be denied this because he couldn't stay with her, because his very life was being threatened. So he's lost still another crutch, his wife. Okay, David is a fugitive now. And so Saul is very upset with Michal, and she lies and tells her dad, he threatened to kill me if I didn't help him. That was in 1 Samuel 19, 17, and part of 17. And so then David has to figure out, where in the world am I going? I have no place to go. So in 1 Samuel 19 and 18, it says, Now David fled and escaped and came to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. And he and Samuel went and stayed in Naioth. Now, I don't know anything about Naioth, but Chuck Swindoll, being the great researcher that he is, found out a little bit about it. So let's look at what he found out. In an archaeological dig at Naioth some time ago, the archaeologists found ancient remains of what we would call condominiums, houses built back to back, side to side, top to bottom, a maze-like arrangement. No wonder Samuel said, let's go to Naioth. That's the kind of place where they can't find us. So Samuel was a man of God, but he feared Saul too. And he and David took off and ran to find a hiding place. And this is where they found it. But, as happens in many cases, somebody saw them and reported to Saul and said, they've gone to Naioth if you want them. So that meant that he had to leave Samuel and flee again, which he did. David was losing all his support, everything he could have leaned on, his position in the king's court and in the army, his wife, and now Samuel. David's emotional stability is slowly eroding. You know, we're talking about the champion of Israel. His stability is eroding. This just goes to show us that what's true one year will maybe be totally the opposite the next year in our lives. Many people are like David. They have ups and downs in their lives. Most people do not have smooth sailing all the time. If you see somebody who does, if you watch them a little longer, somewhere something's going to happen probably that's going to change their life pattern. But David has seen such a vast change in his. So next, David remembers his best friend. Remember who his best friend was? Saul's son, Jonathan. So he goes and contacts Jonathan, and they get together, and David says, why is your father trying to kill me? What have I done wrong? What sin have I committed? Why is he doing this, Jonathan? And Jonathan can't believe his ears. He says, David, my friend, you are not going to die. My father does nothing great or small without telling me about it. So why would he hide something like this from me? It just can't be. Jonathan had no clue about Saul's feelings. He was keeping them from Jonathan because he knew the friendship existed between David and Jonathan. Here's 1 Samuel 20 and 3. Yet David vowed again, saying, your father knows well that I have found favor in your sight. And he has said, do not let Jonathan know this, lest he be grieved. But truly as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, there is hardly a step between me and death. Wow, that's a pretty profound statement. There's hardly a step between me and death. Have you ever felt like that life was so treacherous at the moment that you just didn't know what was going to happen next? Maybe it could be death, maybe who knows what. And I think there's some people who are feeling like that right now, especially if they have contracted the coronavirus. They may feel like death is right on their doorstep. But we cannot let go of our faith, can we? That can sustain us. And we're going to see that more as this lesson advances. The truth, of course, was that Saul hated David and wanted him dead. In a poignant exchange, David and Jonathan came to that moment of truth and what it will require. 1 Samuel 20:42. And Jonathan said to David, go in safety, inasmuch as we have sworn to each other in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord will be between me and you, and between my descendants and your descendants forever. Then he rose and departed, while Jonathan went into the city. So there's another crutch removed. David can't see his friend anymore. So every one of the things that David depended on in his human life is being pulled away. And we've got another thing to see about David that's going to be truly remarkable. So David has nobody left in his world. So the next final blow is David is going to lose his self-respect. 1 Samuel 21:10. Then David arose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. Now, do you remember where Gath was? It's the city that Goliath was from. It's a Philistine city. It's not even an Israeli city. And he's gone up there, of all places. You know, he felt like he had no place to go in his own country. So he's without hope. 1 Samuel 21:11 says, but the servants of Achish said to him, is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of this one as they danced, saying, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s? So David was recognized even here. He couldn't hide even in this foreign country. 1 Samuel 21:12-13, and David took these words to heart and greatly feared Achish, king of Gath. So he disguised his sanity before them and acted insanely in their hands and scribbled on the doors of the gate and let his saliva run down his beard. So he's gone into this act of insanity to convince them he's not in his right mind. And they probably are willing to believe it because here he has come to their city, the man that killed Goliath. What do you think they wanted to do to him? He probably had a bounty on his head. That's our champion, the champion of Israel, foaming at the mouth, scratching at the gate, looking like a madman that dribbles into his beard. David had hit rock bottom. Chuck Swindoll says, when every one of your crutches is removed, things begin to erode. As the erosion continues, you begin to think differently, and then you begin to replace those thoughts with strange thoughts. And then you begin to lose sight of the truth. And then you hit rock bottom. Okay, look at 1 Samuel 21:14-15. Then Achish said to his servants, behold, you see the man behaving as a madman. Why do you bring him to me? Do I lack madmen, that you have brought this one to act the madman in my presence? Shall this one come into my house? In other words, he's saying, I've already got enough nuts in my house, in my kingdom. I don't need another one. So he apparently felt sorry for David enough that he didn't kill him. He says, get rid of him. So David couldn't even find any help in the enemy's camp. So here's kind of a summation of what's happened to David. David had a position, and he lost it. He had a wife, and he lost her. He had a wise counselor, and he lost him. He had a friend, and he lost him. He had self-respect, and he lost it. Not unlike Job, it hit him with such back-to-back force, his head must have spun for hours. Now, there's a lot of time between David and our present time. But this man and his experiences have relevance for us because some of us have experienced some of these losses of our earthly crutches. As children, we lean on our parents. In school, we lean on our teachers, our peers, and even on education itself. As we head toward some ideal or goal, we lean on our hope for the future. When we reach adulthood, we lean on our job, our profession, our mate, or our financial security. We may lean on an older friend who is like an adult parent to us. All these things can become crutches and can have bad effects on our lives. Now again, let me say crutches are not bad. These things are not bad at all. We've talked about how important it is to have good friends. We know it's important to have spiritual advisors. We know it's important to have a good spouse. So these crutches are not bad in themselves. But what God was teaching David was that you can't always depend on your earthly crutches, but you can always depend on me. He did not lose God. God was still with him. Crutches become substitutes for God sometimes. And God was teaching David that. Crutches keep our focus horizontal, looking at those around us instead of looking up to God. Crutches offer only temporary relief. They can't be with us all the time. God can be with us every minute of every day. God doesn't give temporary relief. He offers a permanent solution. So what we're seeing today is that in life, those that we depend on can be snatched away from us, or the things that we depend on can be snatched away from us. Our health, our wealth, our companion, our position, any of those things can be snatched away. But God never can. He will be with you to the end if you just remember that. When you're under attack, don't forget God is still there. He is still with you, and He can bring you through anything. And He's, just like Job, He's able to replace all you lost. He's able to replace your best friend. He's able to replace your children if they're lost. He's able to replace anything, just as He did for Job. And so David was kind of a Job, and we see really a great outcome coming for David in the future, but it sure hasn't happened now, because now he's acting like an insane man, a man who doesn't know anything about anything. And this is that great man that God has anointed to be His next king. Isn't God great that He can take what looks like an impossible situation and still hang on to you if you just hang on to Him? Don't let go of Him. He's not going to let go of you. And He will bring you through. Let's have a word of prayer. God, we're so thankful that when life hands us all kinds of difficulties, and heartaches, and problems, and when we lose the help of those that we've depended on and trusted in, or the wealth, or the position, or whatever we lose, we still have You, and we will never lose You. You will never let go of us. Help us to not let go of You, and to recognize that You're our source for the rest of our life and everything we do. And we thank You for it. Amen. Once again, we're so glad you joined us. We hope that you will take the lesson that David had to learn. It was a bad lesson, a difficult lesson. We hope you'll recognize maybe some things in your life that maybe you need to recognize could be temporary. They may not be, but they could be. And hold on to God as your unchanging, undying, never to lose source. Come back next week. David has more to tell you. We'll see you then.